Who is the secret lover, unknown to her relatives, whom Marie met and spent the day with? And what did her mother mean when she said, "I fear that I shall never see Marie again"?
It sounds like she knew something more.
Indeed.
Welcome to Meteoread Audiobooks, your best companion, where classic tales are brought to life like never before. Today, we celebrate the birthday of Edgar Allan Poe, born January 19th, 1809, the master of mystery and the macabre. What better way to honor him than with The Mystery of Marie Rogêt, a chilling tale based on a true story. Inspired by the real-life case of Mary Cecilia Rogers, whose death shocked America in 1841, Poe reimagines the tragedy in the streets of Paris. Through his brilliant detective, Auguste Dupin, Poe explores logic, deduction, and the shadows of human nature. Note that this is a highly narrative story, so you'll experience less music and sound effects. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let the mystery sweep you off your feet. The truth hides in plain sight.
Even the calmest minds have occasionally been unsettled by coincidences so eerie they seem to defy logic. These fleeting beliefs in the supernatural rarely fade completely without invoking probability, an exact science applied to the shadowy realm of speculation. The strange events I now feel compelled to share mark the beginning of a series of almost incomprehensible coincidences, the conclusion of which many may recognize in the recent murder of Mary Cecilia Rogers in New York. When I wrote The Murders in the Rue Morgue about a year ago, describing the unique mind of my friend, Chevalier C. Auguste Dupin, I thought I'd said all there was to say. My goal was to reveal his unusual character, which I believed I had illustrated well enough. But recent developments have compelled me to share more, details that may sound like forced confessions. Knowing what I do now, it would indeed be strange for me to stay silent about what I once saw and heard. After resolving the Rue Morgue case, Dupin quickly dismissed it from his mind, slipping back into his usual habits of moody reverie. I, similarly inclined, joined him in this peaceful routine. We kept our quarters in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, content to live in the moment, weaving the dull world around us into dreams. Yet, our peace was not entirely undisturbed. Given Dupin's role in the Rue Morgue affair, it's no surprise that his actions left a strong impression on the Parisian police, who came to revere his name. His seemingly simple deductions, never explained beyond me, took on a near miraculous reputation, giving Dupin the aura of supernatural intuition. Though his honesty might have led him to dispel this myth, his indifference kept him silent, leaving him a figure of intrigue. Eventually, he became a point of interest for the authorities, who sought his insight in several cases, most notably in the murder of a young woman named Marie Rogêt. This incident took place about 2 years after the Rue Morgue tragedy. Marie, whose name closely resembles that of the ill-fated cigar girl, was the only daughter of the widow Estelle Rogêt. Marie's father had died when she was an infant, and ever since, she and her mother had lived together on Rue Pavée Saint-André. Madame Rogêt ran a small boarding house there, with Marie helping out. Life continued this way until Marie turned 22, when her striking beauty caught the attention of a perfumer who ran a shop on the ground floor of the Palais Royal. His main customers were the rough adventurers that roamed the area. Monsieur Leblanc, the perfumer, recognized that Marie's presence in his shop could be quite profitable. He made her a generous offer, which she accepted, though her mother was somewhat hesitant. Monsieur Leblanc's expectations were met, and his shop quickly became well known thanks to Marie's charm. After about a year in his employ, however, Marie's sudden disappearance startled her admirers. Neither Monsieur Leblanc nor Madame Rogêt could explain where she had gone, and Madame was consumed with worry. The newspapers picked up the story, and the police were close to launching an investigation when, after a week, Marie reappeared at her usual place in the shop, looking healthy but somewhat subdued. Public inquiry stopped, though some private questioning continued. Monsieur Leblanc claimed to know nothing, and both Marie and her mother insisted that she had simply been visiting relatives in the countryside. With that, the issue faded from memory, and soon after, Marie left the perfumery for good, returning to her mother's home. About 5 months after coming home, Marie vanished again, alarming her friends and family. 3 days passed with no news. On the 4th day, her body was found floating in the Seine, near the shore across from Rue Saint-André, not far from the quiet area around Barrière du Roule. The brutality of this murder. There was no doubt it was murder. The youth and beauty of the victim and her recent notoriety created a storm of outrage among Parisians. I can recall no similar event that stirred such intense, widespread emotion. For weeks, the city was absorbed in this single story, with even major political issues falling by the wayside. The prefect made extraordinary efforts, and the entire Parisian police force was pushed to its limits in response. When the body was first discovered, there was confidence that the murderer would be caught quickly, and a prompt investigation was launched. A reward wasn't offered until a week had passed, and even then, it was only 1,000 francs. The investigation proceeded energetically, though not always wisely, with many people questioned but to no avail, and the lack of progress only fueled public frustration. After 10 days, the reward was doubled. But still, no leads emerged. By the end of the second week, with no new discoveries and public anger erupting in street protests, the prefect raised the reward to 20,000 francs for the conviction of the assassin, or, if there were multiple culprits, for the conviction of any one of them. To encourage confessions, a full pardon was promised to any accomplice who testified against the others. Additionally, a citizens' committee offered 10,000 francs, raising the total to a significant 30,000 francs. A hefty sum, especially considering Marie's modest background. At this point, it seemed certain the case would be solved. Yet, despite some promising arrests, nothing substantial was revealed, and all suspects were quickly released. Oddly, it wasn't until the third week after the body's discovery that news of the case even reached Dupin and me. Absorbed in our own research, we'd hardly left our quarters or kept up with current events. The first we heard of the murder was from G, who visited us in person on the afternoon of July 13, 1800 and something. He stayed late into the night, frustrated by his failed efforts to catch the killer. As he put it, his reputation and even his honor were on the line. He was willing to go to any length to solve the case. After a rather colorful speech, he complimented Dupin's tact and made a generous offer, though I'm not at liberty to reveal its exact nature. Dupin deflected the compliment, but accepted the offer without hesitation, though the reward was purely conditional. With that, the prefect launched into a detailed explanation of his theories, punctuated by lengthy commentary on the evidence, which we had not yet reviewed. He talked at length, and often with impressive detail, while I occasionally offered a suggestion as the hours passed. Dupin seated quietly in his favorite armchair, appeared to be fully engaged, wearing his spectacles throughout. Yet I noticed, with a glance here and there, that he dozed comfortably behind his green lenses, sleeping soundly, if silently, through most of the prefect's 7-hour monologue. The morning after Dupin accepted the case, I gathered all available evidence and news reports. After removing what was disproven, the information was as follows. Marie Rogêt left her mother's home on Rue Pavée, Saint-André, around 9 a.m. on Sunday, June 22nd, informing only her fiancé, Monsieur Jacques Saint-Eustache, that she planned to visit an aunt on Rue des Drômes. Saint-Eustache, who lived with Marie and her mother, had intended to bring her home at dusk, but due to rain, he assumed she'd stay overnight as she had before. That evening, Marie's elderly mother expressed a vague fear for her daughter's safety, but this was mostly dismissed. By Monday, it was clear that Marie hadn't reached her aunt's home. After days of searching, Monsieur Beauvais, out investigating near the Seine, learned of a body that had been brought ashore. Beauvais hesitated, but identified it as Marie. A friend confirmed the recognition. The body bore signs of assault. Dark blood stained her face. There was no foam as with drowning, and bruises marked her neck. Her arms were stiff, with the right hand clenched. Marks on her wrists suggested bindings, and her back was chafed, especially near her shoulders. A tightly tied lace around her neck, buried into her skin, was deemed fatal by medical experts, who confirmed she'd suffered a brutal attack. Her clothing was torn and disordered. A strip from her outer garment was wrapped around her waist, and another from her muslin dress was loosely tied around her neck. Her bonnet strings were tied with a sailor's knot, unusual for a woman. Following her identification, Marie's body was hastily buried nearby, but public curiosity soon led to its exhumation. Her clothes were shown to her family, who confirmed they were hers. As the days passed, public excitement grew. Several people were arrested and then released, with Saint-Eustache coming under particular suspicion. Initially, he couldn't provide a clear account of his whereabouts on the Sunday Marie disappeared, but later he presented affidavits to Monsieur Gargoyle, explaining his actions throughout the day to everyone's satisfaction. Despite these efforts, no progress was made in the case, and numerous contradictory rumors began to spread. Journalists, eager for answers, fueled speculation. One of the most prominent theories was that Marie Rogêt might still be alive, and that the body found in the Seine belonged to someone else. To shed light on this theory, I'll present a few excerpts from L'Étoile, a paper known for its insightful commentary.
Mademoiselle Rogêt left her mother's house on Sunday morning, June 22nd, to visit her aunt in the Rue des Drômes, but no one has come forward to say they saw her after she left. While there's no proof she was alive after 9 o'clock that morning, we know she was alive up until then. On Wednesday, a body was found floating near the Barrière du Roule. Even if Marie was thrown into the river within 3 hours of leaving her house, it would have only been 3 days since she left home. However, it seems impossible that the murder, if one occurred, could have been committed quickly enough to allow her body to be disposed of before midnight. Murderers typically act in darkness, making it unlikely the body was thrown in the river so soon. Bodies that are drowned or violently thrown into the water usually take 6 to 10 days to decompose enough to surface. Even if the body had been in the water for 2 days, it is highly unlikely it would have floated so soon without some outside cause. Additionally, it's improbable that the murderers would not have weighed the body down to ensure it sank, which would have been an easy precaution to take.
The editor argues that the body must have been in the water not just 3 days, but at least 15 days, given its advanced state of decomposition, which made it hard for Beauvais to identify. However, this claim was later disproven. Here's the continuation of the translation.
So, what evidence does Monsieur Beauvais have to be sure the body was Marie Rogêt's? He cut open her dress sleeve, finding marks that he claimed confirmed her identity. People assumed he meant scars, but he simply found hair on the arm. Hardly conclusive. Beauvais informed Madame Rogêt on Wednesday evening that the investigation was ongoing. Even if grief kept her from going, someone should have followed up if they believed the body was Marie's. But no one did. Not even Marie's fiancé, Saint Eustache, who didn't learn of the discovery until Beauvais told him the next morning, remarkably indifferent for news like this.
The newspaper tried to suggest that Marie's relatives were oddly indifferent. Casting doubt on whether they actually believed the body found was hers. It insinuated that Marie, with her family's consent, had left the city to avoid a scandal, and that upon discovering a similar-looking corpse in the Seine, they took the opportunity to convince the public she was dead. But L'Étoile misjudged once again. It was clearly shown that this supposed indifference didn't exist. Marie's elderly relative was frail and deeply shaken, too distressed to handle any formalities. Saint Eustache, rather than responding coolly, was overcome with grief and acted so erratically that Monsieur Beauvais had a friend take charge of him, even preventing him from attending the examination at the disinterment. Furthermore, L'Étoile claimed the burial was paid for by the state because the family declined a private ceremony, and no family members attended. But all of this was later disproved. The paper later tried to shift suspicion toward Beauvais himself. The editor wrote,
Now, the story takes a turn. We hear that, once while Madame B. was at Madame Rogêt's house, Monsieur Beauvais, preparing to leave, told her that a gendarme was expected and instructed her to say nothing to him until he returned. With things as they stand, Monsieur Beauvais seems to be at the center of it all. You can't move without encountering him. He somehow made himself the sole overseer of the case, sidelining male relatives, as they claim, in a rather peculiar way. He even seemed reluctant to let the family see the body.
One observation fueled this suspicion. A visitor to Beauvais' office a few days before Marie's disappearance saw a rose in the keyhole, and Marie written on a nearby slate. From what we could gather from the papers, the general belief was that Marie had been victimized by a gang, taken across the river, assaulted, and killed. However, Le Commerciel, a respected publication, opposed this view. Here's a passage from one of its columns.
We're convinced the investigation has missed the mark, especially by focusing on the Barrière du Roule. It's impossible that a young woman as well known as she was could have walked 3 blocks without being noticed. She went out when the streets were full. If she had traveled that far, a dozen people would have seen her, yet no one came forward to say they saw her beyond her mother's door. There's no proof she even left, aside from her stated intentions. Her gown was torn, wrapped, and tied around her, which suggests she was carried like a bundle. If the murder happened at the Barrière du Roule, this wouldn't have been necessary. That her body was found floating near the barrier doesn't prove where it was thrown in. A piece of her petticoat was torn out, tied around her head, likely to muffle her screams, a desperate measure by men who lacked even a handkerchief.
A day or two before the prefect visited us, however, crucial information came to light that seemed to disprove much of Le Commerciel's argument. 2 young boys, sons of a Madame de Luc, were playing near the Barrière du Roule when they ventured into a dense thicket. There, they found several large stones arranged as a seat, with a backrest and footstool. On one stone lay a white petticoat, and on another, a silk scarf. A parasol, gloves, and a pocket handkerchief were also found, the handkerchief bearing the name Marie Rogêt. Fragments of clothing were caught in the surrounding brambles. The ground showed signs of a struggle. Earth was trampled, bushes broken, and the area clearly indicated a violent disturbance. Between the thicket and the river, fences had been taken down, and the ground bore marks of a heavy load being dragged along. A weekly paper, Le Soleil, shared the following observations on the discovery, reflecting the general sentiment of the Parisian press.
It's clear the items had been there for at least 3 or 4 weeks, all weathered and mildewed from the rain, stuck together in clumps. Grass had grown around and over some of them. The parasol's silk was still intact, but the interior threads had fused. The part that had been folded was rotten and tore when opened. The pieces of her dress found in the bushes were about 3 inches wide and 6 inches long. One piece was the hem, mended, while the other was from the skirt. They appeared to be strips torn off and were caught in a thorn bush about a foot from the ground. It's clear, therefore, that the scene of this terrible crime has been found. And
Following this discovery, new evidence emerged. Madame Deluc, who runs a roadside inn near the riverbank, not far from the Barrière du Roule, testified that the area is secluded, a retreat for troublemakers from the city who cross the river by boat. On the Sunday in question, around 3 p.m., a young woman arrived at the inn with a dark-complexioned young man. They stayed for a while before heading into the nearby woods. Madame Deluc took note of the woman's dress, which resembled that of a deceased relative, particularly a scarf she wore. Shortly after they left, a group of rowdy men arrived, drank, and ate without paying, then followed the couple. They returned at dusk and hastily recrossed the river. Later that evening, just after dark, both Madame Deluc and her eldest son heard violent but brief screams from the area around the inn. Madame Deluc recognized the scarf found in the thicket and the dress on the body. An omnibus driver, Valence, also testified that he saw Marie Rogêt crossing a ferry on the Seine with a dark-complexioned young man that Sunday. Valence knew Marie well and was certain of her identity. The items found in the thicket were later confirmed by Marie's relatives as hers. The evidence and information I collected from the newspapers and at Dupin's suggestion revealed one more crucial point. Though seemingly of vast consequence, it appears that immediately after the discovery of the clothes, the lifeless, or nearly lifeless, body of Saint Eustache, Marie's betrothed, was found near what was assumed to be the scene of the crime. A phial labeled laudanum, emptied, was found near him. His breath showed signs of poison. He died without speaking. On his person was a letter briefly expressing his love for Marie and his intention of self-destruction.
I needn't tell you,
said Dupin, finishing my notes,
that this case is more complex than the Rue Morgue. It differs in one crucial way. This is a typical, though horrific crime, nothing outlandish. That's why the mystery has been treated as solvable when it's actually more difficult. Initially, a reward wasn't considered. The agents of Gargoyle quickly understood how and why such a crime could happen. They imagined various methods and motives and assumed one must be true.
And yet, they missed something?
Exactly. The ease with which they entertained these possibilities should have signaled the difficulty, not simplicity, of the case. Only by stepping away from the ordinary does reason find the truth. In cases like this, the key question is not what has happened, but what has never happened before. In Madame L'Espanaye's case, the agents were stymied by the crime's strangeness, which, to a trained mind, was a sign of success. In this case, the ordinary evidence led officials to believe in an easy triumph.
A critical mistake.
In Madame L'Espanaye's case, it was clear a murder had occurred and suicide was dismissed. Similarly, in this case, we're relieved of the notion of self-inflicted death. The body at the Barrière du Roule was found in such a way that there's no uncertainty. But it has been suggested the corpse isn't Marie Rogêt's, the one for whom the reward is offered. We both know this gentleman well, and I needn't tell you not to trust him too far.
A deception, then?
If we trace the murderer and discover the body isn't Marie's, or if we find her alive, all our work will be for nothing. So, the first thing we must do is confirm the body is Marie Rogêt's.
A crucial step.
The public has been swayed by the arguments in L'Étoile, and the paper itself seems convinced, as shown by its opening line. Several morning papers have spoken of the conclusive article in Monday's Étoile. To me, this article proves only the writer's zeal. We must remember, newspapers stir sensation more than they pursue truth. They pursue truth only when it stirs. A paper that follows the common opinion earns little credit. It's those who contradict the popular belief who are seen as profound. In reasoning, as in literature, it's the epigram that gets recognition, though it's of the lowest intellectual merit. What I mean to convey is that it's not the genuine plausibility of the idea that Marie Rogêt is still alive, but rather its melodramatic appeal that has made it so attractive to L'Étoile and ensured its favorable reception among the public. Let's examine the key points of the journal's argument, while avoiding the incoherence in which it is presented. The writer's first aim is to show that the corpse cannot be Marie's, based on the brief time between her disappearance and the discovery of the floating body. He attempts to reduce the time frame to its absolute minimum. In this, he falls into assumption. It is folly to suppose, he claims, that if murder had been committed on her, it could have been done soon enough for the body to be thrown into the river before midnight. But we must ask, why is this folly? Why is it impossible the murder happened just after she left her mother's house? Assassinations have happened at all hours. If the murder took place between 9 a.m. Sunday and just before midnight, there would still have been time to dispose of the body. This assumption amounts to the murder didn't happen at all on Sunday. If we accept L'Étoile's assumption, we open the door to all kinds of unsubstantiated conclusions. The paragraph starting with, "It is folly to suppose," etc., can be more accurately understood as, "It is folly to suppose the murder occurred in such a way that the body was thrown in the river before midnight, while we insist the body wasn't disposed of until after midnight." This is meaningless, but far less ridiculous than what was written. Were I only interested in discrediting L'Étoile's argument, I could leave it at that. However, our concern is with the truth. The sentence has one meaning as written, which I've clarified. But we must go beyond the words to uncover the underlying idea, which the words fail to fully express. The journalist intended to argue that no matter when the murder occurred on Sunday, it was unlikely the killers took the body to the river before midnight. This assumption, I believe, is the real flaw. It assumes the murder happened in such a way and place that the body had to be moved to the river. However, the crime could have been committed right by the river or on the river itself, in which case the body's disposal in the water could have been the most immediate solution at any time. Let me be clear. I'm not suggesting this happened, nor that it aligns with my view of the case. My aim is simply to highlight the bias in L'Étoile's suggestion from the start, which is clearly one-sided. Having already set a boundary that aligns with its preconceived ideas, and assuming the body couldn't have been in the water long if it was indeed Marie's, the journal continues with the claim, all experience has shown that drowned bodies, or those thrown into the water immediately after death by violence, require 6 to 10 days for sufficient decomposition to bring them to the surface. Even when a cannon is fired over a corpse, and it rises before at least 5 or 6 days immersion, it sinks again if left alone. These assertions have been widely accepted by most papers in Paris, except for Le Moniteur. This paper challenges L'Etoile's argument by citing instances where drowned bodies were found floating after a shorter period. However, there's something unphilosophical about Le Moniteur's attempt to dispute L'Etoile's claim by presenting specific, contradicting cases. Even if Le Moniteur had 50 examples instead of 5, they would still be exceptions to L'Etoile's rule, not a refutation of it. The general rule holds until enough contrary cases form a new pattern. Any argument here must challenge the rule itself, so we must consider the reasoning behind it. The human body generally has a specific gravity close to that of fresh water, meaning its weight is nearly equal to the water it displaces. Fat, fleshy people with smaller bones and women tend to be lighter than lean, large-boned men. Also, the specific gravity of water can vary with tides, but a human body generally neither sinks nor floats in fresh water on its own. Almost anyone who falls into a river and allows their body to be fully submerged will float effortlessly. The body should be upright, with the head back, keeping the mouth and nostrils above the surface. In this position, we naturally float. The balance of forces between the body's gravity and displaced water is delicate, and any small shift can change that balance. For example, lifting an arm from the water causes the head to immerse, while even a small piece of timber can raise the head. In those unaccustomed to swimming, the arms instinctively rise as they try to keep the head upright. This causes the mouth and nostrils to submerge, leading to water inhalation. Much of this water enters the stomach and lungs, increasing the body's weight by replacing air with fluid. This added weight usually causes the body to sink, but in individuals with more fat or smaller bones, the added buoyancy may not be enough to submerge them fully, even after death. Such individuals may continue to float even after drowning.
Dupin's analysis of the body's buoyancy, decomposition, and assumptions surrounding the floating corpse challenges L'Etoile's conclusions, urging a more nuanced look at the facts.
The corpse, presumed to be at the bottom of the river, remains there until its specific gravity becomes less than that of the displaced water. This happens due to decomposition or other factors. Decomposition generates gas, distending the tissues and cavities, causing the body to puff up. As the body's bulk increases without a corresponding increase in mass, its specific gravity becomes less than the water's, and the body rises to the surface. However, decomposition is affected by many factors: temperature, water conditions, depth, current, the body's condition, and disease before death. The timing of the body's rise, therefore, is highly uncertain. In some cases, it could happen within an hour. In others, it might never occur. There are also chemicals, like bichloride of mercury, that preserve bodies indefinitely. In addition to decomposition, gas generated in the stomach or other cavities may cause the body to rise. Now, let's examine L'Etoile's claim that drowned bodies need 6 to 10 days to decompose before they float. This claim is flawed. Science and experience show that the timing of a body's rise is indeterminate. If a body rises after a cannon is fired, it will not sink again unless decomposition has allowed gas to escape. Furthermore, L'Etoile incorrectly lumps drowned bodies and bodies thrown into the water immediately after death by violence into the same category. The body of a drowning victim becomes heavier than the water as it fills with water in the lungs and other cavities.
Hey, you still there? Sorry for jumping in while you're listening. Just wanted to quickly mention that we publish stories like this every Sunday. If you're enjoying it, consider subscribing for more. Happy listening.
However, a body thrown into the water after death by violence would not sink initially, as there's no struggle or gasping. It would likely stay at the bottom until decomposition made it lighter. L'Etoile's argument fails to account for the critical difference between drowning and violent death. The body of a drowning person sinks because of the water filling the lungs, while a body thrown in after death typically doesn't sink unless decomposition has progressed significantly. And now, what are we to make of the argument that the body found could not be Marie Rogêt because it was found floating just 3 days after her disappearance? If she had drowned, being a woman, she might never have sunk, or if she had, she could have reappeared in less than 24 hours. But no one believes she drowned, and if she died before being thrown into the river, the body could have been found floating at any time after that. L'Etoile argues that if the body had been kept on shore until Tuesday night, there would have been traces of the murderers. At first, it's hard to understand the reasoning. The writer anticipates an objection, that the body would decompose faster on land than in water. He claims that had it been left on shore, it might have floated by Wednesday. But he quickly asserts that it wasn't kept on shore, because there would be traces of the murderers. I can't see how the mere duration of the body on the shore would leave any traces of the killers. Nor can you. Then, L'Etoile states that it's highly unlikely that the murderers would have thrown the body into the river without attaching weight to it. This is a confusing argument. No one disputes that the body found was that of a murdered woman. The marks of violence are clear. The issue is whether this body is Marie's. The reasoning here only proves that the body wasn't weighed down, which suggests it wasn't thrown into the water by murderers. But this doesn't address the question of identity, and L'Etoile contradicts itself, as it had just admitted that the body was that of a murdered female. Moreover, the reasoning grows even more contradictory when the journal insists that no one saw Marie after she left her mother's house at 9 o'clock on Sunday, June 22nd. If any witness had seen her on Monday or Tuesday, the time between her disappearance and the body's discovery would have been shorter, reducing the likelihood that the body found was hers. Yet, L'Etoile clings to this point, believing it strengthens its case. Now, let's consider the argument regarding the identification of the corpse by Beauvais. L'Etoile is being obviously disingenuous here. Monsieur Beauvais, being no fool, would never have identified the corpse simply based on hair on the arm. No arm is without hair, so L'Etoile is misrepresenting the situation. Beauvais must have referred to some peculiarity in the hair itself, whether in its color, quantity, length, or positioning. Her foot, says the journal, was small, so are thousands of feet. Her garter is no proof, nor is her shoe, since they are sold in packages. Yet Beauvais specifically insists that the clasp on the garter had been adjusted, which is not insignificant. To me, this detail is hard to dismiss. If Monsieur Beauvais, in his search for Marie, found a body that matched her general size and appearance, he would have been right to believe his search was successful. But if, in addition to this, he found a distinctive mark on the arm, like one he had noticed on the living Marie, then his certainty would only increase. The more unusual that mark was, the stronger his conviction would grow. If the feet were similarly small, the body's identity would be more probable. This wouldn't be a simple arithmetic increase, but a geometrically compounded certainty. Add to this that the corpse was wearing shoes identical to those Marie wore on the day of her disappearance, and even L'Etoile's point about shoes being sold in packages becomes irrelevant. If just one flower from her hat is found on the body, we can start to consider the case closed. 2 or 3 or more? The evidence multiplies, not just adds. And when we discover the garters on the corpse are tightened in the same way Marie herself had tightened hers shortly before leaving home, it becomes madness to doubt. To claim that such adjustments are ordinary is a profound error. The elastic clasp on a garter makes such an adjustment uncommon. This was no accident. These garters alone would have established her identity without question. But the corpse didn't just have the garters. It had the shoes, the flowers, the feet, the peculiar mark on the arm. every detail that matched Marie. Could anyone really still doubt the identity of the body under these circumstances? If the editor of L'Etoile truly doubts the identity, I would suggest no further action is needed, for it's obvious that they are clinging to a misguided interpretation. The publication simply echoes the hollow arguments of lawyers, who often repeat standard, unoriginal legal principles, not adapting to the specifics of this case. Courts may, in general, favor these principles, but the philosopher in me knows that in doing so, they ignore individual truths. What L'Etoile rejects as inconclusive evidence is in fact the best proof we have. In regard to the accusations against Beauvais, they should be dismissed quickly. By now, you've seen his true character, a romantic busybody, lacking in wit. In moments of excitement, he may have acted in ways that invited suspicion, but his behavior can be explained by his romantic interest in Marie, not guilt. The editor of L'Etoile criticized him for insisting the body was Marie's, but it's natural for Beauvais to believe something strongly, even without providing convincing evidence to others. The suspicious actions attributed to him, like the rose in the keyhole, the name Marie on the slate, and his attempts to control the situation, make more sense if we consider him as someone trying to appear close to Marie, not as a murderer. He likely wanted to be seen as her confidant. The behavior of Marie's family, far from being apathetic, supports the idea that they believed the body was hers. With this in mind, we can confidently conclude that the identity question is resolved.
And what do you think of the opinions of Le Commerciel? I asked.
The ideas in Le Commerciel are worth considering, but are based on incomplete observations. The paper suggests that Marie must have been seized by a gang near her mother's door because she couldn't have passed 3 blocks without being recognized. This reasoning, however, overlooks the fact that Marie's walks were likely more varied than those of someone who, like a public official, frequents the same area daily. Her route may have been completely different, and it's more than likely that she could have walked anywhere without being recognized. Additionally, the argument about the time Marie left is flawed. Le Commerciel says it was when the streets were full of people, but she left at 9 in the morning, when the streets are actually deserted, especially on Sundays. Finally, the paper speculates that a piece of Marie's petticoat was used to gag her, suggesting it was done by ruffians without handkerchiefs. However, it's a well-known fact that even the lowest of criminals usually have handkerchiefs, making this assumption highly questionable.
And what are we to think of the article in Le Soleil?
It's unfortunate that the author of Le Soleil was not born a parrot, as he only repeats previously published opinions. His statements do nothing to resolve my doubts. The facts he presents are no more convincing than those already discussed. At this stage, we must focus on other aspects, particularly the poor examination of the body. Key questions remain unanswered. Was the body despoiled? Did the deceased have jewelry when she left home? And was it still present when found? These crucial points were not investigated. Let's shift our focus to the wider context of the case. It's a common error in investigations to limit inquiry to the immediate facts, neglecting collateral events that can often yield the most valuable insights. Experience has shown that seemingly irrelevant details can lead to significant discoveries. Modern science has embraced the role of chance, using it as a calculated factor in investigations. In this case, we should not limit our analysis to the direct facts, but instead broaden our inquiry to include the surrounding circumstances. While you check the affidavits, I will dig deeper into the newspapers to find overlooked details that could provide a new direction for our investigation.
In following Dupin's suggestion, I carefully examined the affidavits and became convinced of their validity, thus confirming Saint Eustache's innocence. Meanwhile, Dupin, to my surprise, meticulously reviewed newspaper files. After a week, he presented me with these extracts: evening paper, Monday, June 23rd. About 3.5 years ago, Marie Rogêt disappeared from Leblanc's Parfumerie, only to reappear a week later, slightly pale. It was claimed she had been visiting a friend, and the matter was quickly forgotten. This current disappearance may be similar, and she may return in a week or month. Le Mercury, Tuesday morning, June 24th. It's known that during Marie's previous absence, she was with a notorious naval officer. A quarrel, it's said, led to her return. We know the officer's name, but will withhold it. Morning paper, June 25th. A disturbing incident occurred near Paris. A young woman, traveling with her parents, was abducted by a gang after returning to retrieve a forgotten parasol. The attackers are still at large, but the police are on their trail. Morning paper, June 28th. Some communications attempt to link Menes to the recent crime, but since he's been exonerated by a legal inquiry and the arguments are weak, we choose not to publish them. Evening paper, Tuesday, June 31st. Several communications suggest Marie Rogêt was a victim of one of the many gangs around the city on Sundays. We lean toward this theory and may publish some of these arguments soon. La Diligence, Thursday, June 26th. On Monday, a bargeman found an empty boat floating down the Seine with sails in the bottom. It was towed to the barge office, but was removed the next morning, and the rudder is now there.
I do not wish to focus on the first two newspaper extracts, but they highlight the police's failure to investigate the naval officer mentioned. The connection between Marie's first and second disappearances is clear. The first disappearance likely stemmed from a quarrel with her lover, and the second could indicate a renewal of that affair rather than a new romance. It's highly probable that the same person who had eloped with her before would again propose it upon returning from sea, but we know nothing for sure.
Not even his identity?
Not yet. While it's true there was no confirmed elopement, we cannot dismiss the possibility of a frustrated plan. Besides Saint Eustache and perhaps Beauvais, no other suitors are mentioned, yet someone must have been with her that day. Who is the secret lover, unknown to her relatives, whom Marie met and spent the day with? And what did her mother mean when she said, "I fear that I shall never see Marie again"?
It sounds like she knew something more.
Indeed. Though Marie told her mother she was visiting her aunt, and Saint Eustache was to pick her up in the evening, this fact doesn't rule out the idea of an elopement. She must have known that her absence would alarm Saint Eustache and others, but if she intended to elope, she'd need time to avoid interruption. By saying she would be at her aunt's, she would gain extra time without raising suspicion. If she hadn't arranged for Saint Eustache to call, her absence would be noticed sooner. But if she planned not to return, this would ensure she had all the time needed for her escape.
A clever ruse, if that's truly her plan.
You have noticed that the most widespread theory is that Marie fell victim to a gang of criminals. While public opinion can often be insightful, we must be cautious when it arises under specific conditions. In this case, it seems to me that the idea of a gang has been influenced by the public's association of two similar crimes. The first crime, the assault on another young woman by a gang, was committed around the same time that Marie's body was discovered. The public naturally linked the two, because the circumstances seemed to align so well. However, it is highly improbable that two gangs would commit two similar crimes in the same place, at the same time, with the same methods. The similarity between these crimes might be coincidental, and this spontaneous public theory may have been formed based on this assumption rather than any real evidence. Now, let's turn to the supposed scene of the crime, the thicket at the Barrière du Roule. The area was near a public road and contained several items of Marie's clothing, her petticoat, scarf, gloves, parasol, and a handkerchief with her name on it. This discovery was hailed as proof that this was the exact location of the crime. However, I have reservations about this conclusion. While the evidence suggests the possibility that this was the scene, I believe we must be skeptical. The thicket's proximity to a public road means it would have been risky for any criminals to leave evidence there. It's quite plausible that someone might have placed the items there deliberately, knowing that public attention had turned to the location. Furthermore, Le Soleil's description of the items being mildewed raises some doubts. Grass grows quickly in damp weather, and a parasol could have been concealed by the grass in just a few days. As for the mildew, it's important to note that it is a type of fungus that can form and decay within a matter of hours. The report's insistence on the presence of mildew seems to ignore the nature of this process, and could be a result of mistaken perception rather than reliable observation. In sum, the idea that the Barrière du Roule thicket is the precise crime scene is far from certain. It is an assumption based on circumstantial evidence that could easily have been manipulated, intentionally or not, by those who discovered the items. The claims that the articles found in the thicket had been there for 3 or 4 weeks are completely baseless. In fact, it is highly improbable that they could have remained in that location for even a week, let alone a month. Paris, as anyone familiar with the area knows, is surrounded by dense populations and frequenters of every kind, especially on Sundays. There is simply no place within easy reach of the city where seclusion could be guaranteed for long, particularly in the woods or groves around Paris. The areas where nature might appear unspoiled are most often frequented by loiterers and those seeking to escape the constraints of society. These individuals are known for their reckless behavior, and the proximity of such a rowdy population makes it impossible for any item to remain undisturbed in an isolated area for an extended period. To think that the articles could have been left unnoticed in the Barrière du Roule thicket for weeks is therefore nearly miraculous. The area is simply too close to Paris, too often visited, for something to go undiscovered for so long. Indeed, if the articles had been in the thicket for any length of time, they would have been found far sooner. The idea that they remained there unnoticed is so improbable that we must consider the possibility that the items were placed there deliberately after the fact, with the intention of misdirecting the investigation. Now, consider the timing of the discovery of these items in relation to the communications sent to the press, especially the urgent letters to the evening paper. The timing is too suspicious. These letters, published almost immediately before the discovery, focused public attention on a gang of criminals and the Barrière du Roule as the crime scene. This, I believe, is where the plot thickens. It seems likely that the items were not found by the boys until after the letters had been published, suggesting that they were placed in the thicket deliberately to respond to the public's growing suspicion. The items may not have been there initially, but after these communications, they were placed to create the impression of a violent scene and support the gang theory. Therefore, it is not just the improbability of the items being left there for weeks that raises suspicion. It is the highly convenient timing of their discovery, following the media's intensified focus on the Barrière du Roule, that casts doubt on the authenticity of this evidence. It appears far more likely that the items were planted to mislead and confuse the investigation. This thicket was singularly dense, surrounded by extraordinary stones forming a seat with a back and footstool. It lay near the home of Madame de Luc, whose boys often searched the shrubberies nearby. It's hard to believe that a day passed without one of these boys finding himself in that secluded spot. Given this, it's difficult to comprehend how the articles could have gone unnoticed for more than a day or two. The idea that they were undisturbed for longer than that seems implausible, despite Le Soleil's ignorance on the matter. There is clear reason to suspect that the items were placed there recently. However, There are even stronger grounds for this suspicion. The arrangement of the articles is notably artificial. A petticoat lay on one stone, a scarf on another, with a parasol, gloves, and a handkerchief bearing Marie Rogêt scattered around. This setup, though seemingly natural, is suspiciously neat, as one would expect the items to be trampled if they had been part of a violent struggle. The presence of a struggle is confirmed by the trampled earth and broken bushes, yet the petticoat and scarf are found almost as if carefully arranged on shelves. Furthermore, Le Soleil describes pieces of the dress that appear to have been torn off, but the nature of the fabric makes this unlikely. Thorns rarely tear such material in a way that would leave clean, rectangular strips. For this to happen, two distinct forces would be needed, which is not a likely scenario. The description of these pieces being torn, particularly from areas like the hem or skirt, is hard to believe. It suggests that the fabric was deliberately cut or torn, not by chance. This, combined with the strange placement of the articles, points more to the items being placed there after the fact to mislead investigators. While I'm not denying that the thicket could be the scene of the crime or even a point of struggle, the critical issue here is not where the crime took place, but who committed it. The key question is whether the murder was the work of a gang, as the evidence and the circumstances seem to suggest. We need only refer briefly to the surgeon's revolting testimony at the inquest, which has been ridiculed by reputable anatomists in Paris. His conclusions about the number of ruffians are baseless, not because the crime couldn't have been committed by multiple individuals, but because there was no evidence to suggest this. Wasn't there more evidence supporting another theory? Consider the traces of a struggle that have been used to argue for a gang. Don't these traces actually argue against it? What kind of violent and enduring struggle could have left such signs between a lone defenseless girl and a gang? A few rough hands would have easily subdued her, and she would have been passive in their grasp. The evidence against the thicket as the scene of a gang crime is strong, but if only one assailant was involved, we can understand how a violent struggle could leave such traces. I've also already pointed out the oddity of the articles being left in the thicket at all. If the murderer had the presence of mind to remove the body, why would he leave more obvious evidence of guilt behind, like the handkerchief with the victim's name? If it was accidental, it wasn't the kind of mistake a gang would make. It suggests the actions of an individual. Imagine this: a solitary murderer, alone with his victim's lifeless body. He's appalled by what he's done, and as his passion fades, fear takes over. He has to dispose of the body, but in his terror, he's too frightened to carry everything at once. He leaves behind the handkerchief and returns to collect it. But as he moves through the night, every sound and shadow terrifies him. Eventually, he reaches the river and discards the body. But what would make him return for the rest of the evidence? It's unimaginable. He would flee from the scene, never to return. Now consider a gang. Their numbers would have given them confidence. If one or two had missed something, a third or fourth would have noticed and corrected it. They would have carried everything at once and left no trace behind. There would be no need for a return trip. Consider the fact that a slip had been torn from the victim's outer garment, about a foot wide, and wound 3 times around her waist, secured with a knot at the back. The obvious purpose was to provide a handle to carry the body. But would any group of men have resorted to such an expedient? For 3 or 4 men, the limbs of the corpse would have been more than enough to carry it. This suggests the work of a single individual. Additionally, between the thicket and the river, the fence rails were found taken down, and there were clear signs of a heavy burden being dragged along the ground. Would a gang have gone to the trouble of removing the fence to drag the body when they could have easily lifted it over? Next, We turn to an observation from Le Commercial that I've addressed before. The journal claims a piece of the victim's petticoat was tied under her chin and around her head, likely to prevent screams, as if the attackers had no handkerchiefs. I've already pointed out that a real blackguard is never without one, and that the handkerchief left in the thicket disproves the idea that this bandage was used for that purpose. Furthermore, the strip around the neck was described as loosely fitting and secured with a hard knot, which differs from the claim in Le Commercial. The strip was 18 inches wide, which, though made of muslin, would form a strong band when folded. My conclusion is this: the murderer, after carrying the body for some distance using the bandage around the waist, found it too heavy. He decided to drag it, and evidence shows it was dragged. To do so, he needed to secure the neck with something like a rope. The bandage around the waist wasn't suitable due to its awkward knot and the fact it hadn't been torn off. So, he tore a new strip from the petticoat, secured it around the neck, and dragged the body to the river. This bandage, clearly not ideal and requiring effort to make, suggests it was used only after leaving the thicket when the handkerchief was no longer available. Now, you might argue that Madame Deluc's testimony points to a gang's presence near the thicket at the time of the murder. I'll grant that. I'd even wager there were many such gangs around the Barrière du Roule at the time. But the gang that has been pointed to, according to Madame Deluc, was the one that, after eating her cakes and drinking her brandy, failed to pay. Could this be the source of her ire? The precise evidence of Madame Deluc is that a gang of miscreants appeared at her inn, ate and drank without paying, followed the route of the young man and girl, returned around dusk, and recrossed the river in great haste. Madame Deluc emphasizes this great haste, possibly due to her frustration over the unpaid cakes and ale. However, one might wonder why the haste seemed so significant to her unless she was still hopeful of compensation. It is not unusual for a group to hurry when crossing a river in small boats, especially as night approaches and stormy weather looms. Madame Deluc's account also notes hearing the screams of a woman soon after dark, but the timeline is unclear. She describes it as occurring soon after dark, while the gang's departure is recorded as being around about dusk, a significant difference. This suggests that the gang left the Barrière du Roule before the screams were heard, casting doubt on their involvement in the crime. Despite the discrepancy in the timeline, no public journal or police official has yet commented on this inconsistency. I'll add one more point against the idea of a gang, and this one, at least in my view, is impossible to ignore. Given the large reward and full pardon offered to anyone who turns King's evidence, it's unimaginable that a member of a group of criminals hasn't betrayed his accomplices by now. Each member of such a group isn't just motivated by greed or escape, but by fear of being betrayed. He betrays first to avoid being the one betrayed. The fact that the secret remains hidden proves it truly is a secret. Only one or two people, alive today, know the details of this crime, and God himself. To summarize our conclusions, we've arrived at two possibilities. Either a fatal accident occurred at Madame Deluc's house, or a murder took place near the Barrière du Roule, committed by a lover or a close associate of the victim. This companion has a dark complexion. His complexion, the odd detail with the bandage, and the sailor's knot on the bonnet ribbon point to him being a seaman. The victim's lively, yet not destitute nature suggests he was not a common sailor. Letters sent to the press support this theory. The first elopement story ties him to the naval officer who led the girl into criminal activity. Now, the disappearance of the dark-complexioned man is key. It's important to note that his complexion wasn't ordinary. It was strikingly swarthy, the only thing people remembered about him. Where is this man? Could he have been murdered by the gang? If so, why are we only finding traces of the girl? If the killers disposed of one, why not both? It's also possible he's still alive and staying hidden for fear of being accused. But why didn't he speak up immediately after the crime? If he were innocent, he would have revealed the crime and helped identify the killers. He had crossed the river with the girl. Exposing the killers would have been the surest way to clear his name. We can't believe he was both innocent and unaware of the crime. So, how do we uncover the truth? The ways will become clearer as we investigate. Let's look closely at the first elopement. Let's find out more about the officer, his current situation and whereabouts at the time of the murder. We should also compare letters to the evening papers, which tried to implicate a gang with those sent to the morning paper earlier, accusing Menace. Let's then compare these with the officer's known handwriting. We should talk to Madame Deluc, her sons, and the bus driver Valence to learn more about the dark-complexioned man. Careful questioning might reveal information they're unaware of. Lastly, let's trace the boat found by the bargeman on Monday, June 23rd, which was removed from the barge office without the officer's knowledge and without a rudder before the body was discovered. With persistence, we can track down this boat. The bargeman can identify it, and the rudder is available. A sailor would never leave a rudder behind. But here's the question. No announcement was made about the boat. How did the owner know so early on Tuesday morning where it had been found without an official notice? This suggests a possible connection to the Navy, or some personal relationship with knowledge of such details. In discussing the solitary assassin dragging his burden to the shore, I've already suggested he likely used a boat. We now know that Marie Rogêt was thrown from one. This makes sense, as the body couldn't have been left in the shallow waters near the shore. The marks on the victim's back and shoulders suggest the bottom ribs of a boat. The fact that the body was found without any weight also supports this theory. If it had been thrown from the shore, a weight would have been attached to sink it. Its absence indicates the murderer likely forgot to bring one, and once the body was in the water, it was too late to do anything about it. Any risk was preferable to returning to the scene of the crime. Once rid of the body, the murderer would have quickly fled to the city, perhaps at a quiet wharf. But would he have secured the boat? No, he was too hastily trying to distance himself from his crime. Securing the boat would have felt like securing evidence. It's far more likely that he cast it adrift and fled, eager to leave behind any trace of the murder. In the morning, the murderer would have been struck with horror to find that the boat had been found and detained in a location he frequented, perhaps even one connected to his duties. The next night, desperate not to be tied to it, he would have taken the rudder. And now the question remains, where is that rudderless boat? Finding it should be our first goal. Once we do, we will be closer to uncovering the identity of the man who used it that fatal night. Each new clue will lead us to the murderer faster than we could have imagined.
Editor's note: for reasons we won't specify here, though they may seem obvious to many readers, we have omitted the portion of the manuscript detailing Dupin's pursuit of the seemingly minor clue. Suffice it to say, the desired outcome was achieved, and the prefect, although reluctantly, fulfilled his agreement with the Chevalier. Mr. Poe's article concludes as follows.